Phil Summerville, welcome to the show.
Right. Thanks, Jay. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so this is our second podcast. We did film the first one, but it was a little bit disorganized, I would say, and I really wanted to focus on two main questions today, which I think you're going to be the absolute perfect expert to answer on. But before we get into that, Phil, real quick, can you just give us and the audience a background on where you're coming from and how do you know all this stuff?
Okay, yeah. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Lemoyne College, and during undergrad, I spent a lot of time doing my own research on like sports performance, gym performance, nutrition, anything that can improve body composition on the side in the context of learning about, of course, chemistry, biology, physiology, and classes, which together, of course, you learn a lot of stuff when you're trying to learn about bodybuilding science that a lot of people don't have the background for. So there was a good synergy there. But yeah, I've been studying, I'd say like body composition science for over 10 years. Probably started like when most kids, guys get into the gym in like high school. So if anything has like science related to, I'll usually go pretty deep in it. And then outside of that, as far as like academic credentials, I'm currently in grad school for data science, which can have its own applications in the world of gym performance and bodybuilding.
Yeah, so basically, Phil and I used to go to the same gym, and then the other day I texted him a couple questions, and he was very, very thorough with the scientific breakdown of some of the questions. And some of the questions that I'm asking, even ChatGPT can't really answer correctly. So I was like, this guy definitely needs to be on the podcast. So let's get right into it, okay? Dr. Todd Lee is a medical doctor that I follow who was explaining how there's this general trend of if an androgen, like an anabolic steroid, has 19 carbons, the general trend is that the if the methylation, which allows it to be orally bioavailable, at least more so, is in the later carbons, so carbons 17 or beyond, it tends to be more liver toxic than a methylation or modification in the earlier carbons, carbons 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. My question to you, Phil, is why, from a chemical structure standpoint in liver metabolism, is it that the methylation at later carbons causes more hepatotoxicity compared to the methylation at earlier carbons? For example, methyl DHT versus proviron. Methyl DHT is super, super strong and toxic for a lot of people, but proviron, it's a very, very baby steroid, like almost nobody uses it.
Right. So if you're going to look at the general designer history of androgens, so like we could break it up into, like you said, carbons 1 to 5. And maybe I don't know if you pull up diagrams on the show, but if you could pull up a numbered androgen, if not, the
Yeah,
viewers
we'll
can.
do that right here. We'll do that right here.
Okay. So you see some modifications, like you mentioned, proviron, which is a C1 modification, I believe. The modifications in the earlier number carbons were the intent of the chemist, it seems, is to modify three main things that I'm sure a lot of people who are into like this area of bodybuilding are familiar with. That would be AR, engine receptor sensitivity or affinity, a sensitivity to the aromatase enzyme, so the conversion to estrogens, and then how well it metabolizes into DHT or DHT derivatives by 5 alpha reductase. So those early modifications, the earlier number of carbons, have more to do with that, which are not necessarily involved in metabolic processes that downstream could potentially lead or become involved with liver hepatotoxicity.
So are you saying, Phil, that where the methylation group is, whether it's the earlier carbons or the later carbons, it's rather arbitrary? It has nothing that much to do with the level of liver toxicity. It just happens to be a correlation that's out there.
If you look at the research that's available, even if you look at some of these weird synthetic analogs like methylations at 14, 15, and 16, there's no significant increase in reported hepatotoxicity. Of course, the literature is extremely limited. So yeah, one, two, three, four, and five, these kinds of modified androgens don't become hepatotoxic until you start messing with the C17 alpha position. Of course, we're going to get into why this position, this 17th carbon, is so modifications to it lead to hepatotoxicity.
So some examples of C17 alkylated compounds, I believe off the top of my head, are things like dianabol, halotestin, winstrol,
Yeah, like you
they,
mentioned, methyl DHT.
methyl
Yeah, I think
DHT.
that's the one that used to be available in GNCs,
Pretty
right?
crazy how they allowed some
And like the
extreme
early
pro hormones.
2000s.
Yeah, they actually used to have a pro hormone that turned into trenbolone. Blackstone Labs is the one that used to supply that. But in any case, the C17 modification is the one of interest because it's the most common and it's also known to be the most hepatotoxic. Why is that?
If you take anything, if you take any kind of drug, any kind of substance, your liver is primarily responsible for detoxifying it for excretion, right? And so there's one key enzyme that plays a significant role in the detoxification of androgens, and we'll get into why that's particularly needed. And that's going to be 17 beta HSD, which stands for 17 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. Now, dehydrogenase, if you're going to look at the structure, which you would have put in the screen, you'll see at the 17th number of carbon, there's a hydroxide group, right? OH. And this actually confers much of testosterone androgen in general, their androgenic and anabolic properties, because that is a key site to where it will interact with the androgen receptor. So this enzyme, 17 beta HSD, the D standing for dehydrogenase, is going to remove the hydrogen from this OH group and create a ketone, right? When you add a methyl group to this 17th carbon, essentially the androgen substrate can't interact well at all with this 17 beta HSD. Now, a methyl group is one carbon and there's three hydrogens. So it's kind of this large, relatively large, bulky structure that's attached to the 17th carbon. So if you think about it, the enzyme needs to operate on this hydroxide group, it needs to get its active site in conforming around the hydroxide group. If there is a nearby like relatively large structure like a methyl group, it can't interact with the hydroxide group appropriately to oxidize it. And I have a key right here. And we talked about earlier the modifications to the lower number of carbons, particularly in the case of AR sensitivity, aromatase substrate sensitivity, and 5-alpha reductase. So those other ones, if I'm going to create this, I would create this analogy here. If I were to take this key and add a huge point on one of the teeth, you can't use it in the same lock, right?
Okay.
That's
So
basically what you're doing with the 17 alpha methylation is that it won't fit in the same lock. But
mhm.
like we're talking about with the lower number carbons, that would be like similarly like you keep this same section right here, but you just extended it. So you still have the important part of the key. It's just there's some part in the middle that's different. It's not the same exact key, but you can still use it effectively on locks. Or like if you were to change the handle on the key, you're changing parts of the molecule, but it's still
Mhm.
going to be effective.
So you're saying that anabolic steroids, unlike SARMs, the non-steroidal SARMs, they have a very rigid steroidal plane. It's not very flexible. Now, when we're talking about something like the earlier carbon modifications, it's not necessarily that they're earlier carbon, but the modifications that we do to the earlier carbons, they happen to be within more or less the same plane. And it's not as disrupting for the molecule to be into that 17 beta steroid, 17 hydroxysteroid is a 17 beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, dehydroxysteroid or dehydrogenase.
17
Hydroxysteroid.
beta HSD. It's
Yep.
not going to mess with that enzyme's ability to actually work on that molecule. And by work, I mean really just metabolize it into a less biologically active keto steroid. But a 17 carbon modification, such as the addition of a methyl group, it's really that very modification that makes it orally available is also what kind of makes it liver toxic because it's like really, it can't go in, it cannot go into it because the lock and the key has this random configuration in a completely different plane, which makes it unable or less likely to be attached and metabolized out by that enzyme. Is this the big picture here?
Mostly, yeah. The one thing that I would definitely add on, though, that I mentioned I want to highlight is that these other number of carbons, particularly on the A ring, which is going to be carbons 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, essentially, and 10, um, they have more to do with completely separate metabolic pathways. The ones that I brought up, the androgen receptor aromatase, and 5-alpha reductase. So they
Not
can
17 beta HSD.
not any kind of liver oxidation, liver detoxification pathways. They're all receptor or selectivity, right? So these enzymes are acting on the androgen to change their shape, to change which receptors they interact with. Right? If you look at the testosterone molecule, if you look at an androgen, there are the different parts of the androgen interact with different enzymes, interact with different receptors. Anyone who's taken organic chemistry should know about steric hindrance, how it influences the shape of alkanes. And it's essentially because if you have added alkyl groups, whether it's a methyl or ethyl group, that will get in the way because it'll start to push against other nearby
Mhm.
substituents or like active sites residues. We're talking about methylation, right? Which is just one carbon and three hydrogens. The general term for a substitution with some kind of alkane, which could be one carbon, two carbon, three carbon, etc., is alkylation, which I'm sure you're familiar with that term. So there are some weird designer androgens where instead of 17 alpha methylation, they have tried to add on ethyl, a two carbon group. And now you can imagine this is an even bigger substituent to add on to the androgen. So it'll be an even worse substrate for that 17 beta HSD enzyme, which would hypothetically and seen in the limited research that is available, be even more hepatotoxic. Hepatotoxic.
So theoretically, mole for mole, it's going to be more hepatotoxic, but it's also going to be more orally bioavailable because more of it
Yep.
survives the hepatic first pass metabolism. Now, when it comes to practicality, bodybuilders assess, and other anabolic steroid users, they assess the hepatotoxicity level of their cycle by looking at their liver enzymes, like ALT, AST, GGT being a little bit more of a specific measure to the liver itself. Is the idea here when that goes up? Generally people take that as this is liver toxicity. But is the reason why the liver ramps up the production of those enzymes, is that due to the liver having a hard time breaking it down to begin with, which is why it starts to rev up the enzymes?
Right. In the biological context, there is some metabolic process that is not working, and your body identifies that the substrate is still there. It's just going to produce more enzymes. Now, it does have, now, of course, our bodies have long classes of very different enzymes that it has developed over many years of evolution
Mhm.
to deal with different types of shapes, but there is like this broader idea, or there's this, of course, this idea where just throw more of the same thing at it if the substrate is still there.
Okay, so in this sense, it would suggest that increased liver enzymes is a reflection of liver stress, but it's not actually damaging to the liver stress itself. The liver's just
That
trying really, really hard.
the production of more enzymes that are not effective will induce liver stress, but in the case of these 17 alpha methylated androgens that we're talking about, the main sort of liver damage is going to come from the accumulation of androgens in the liver cells, in the hepatocytes.
Let's go a little bit deeper, specifically smaller scale. So we're talking about right now androgens and enzymes. Let's dive into the atomic level and talk about how the electrons and the balance of those, the free radicals, reactive oxidative stress, how does that come into play at that level if we were to zoom in?
Right. So if we're going to talk about, so already talked about the 17 beta HSD. Now there's multiple enzymes. When your body wants to detoxify something, some compound, it will have many enzymes that will act on it. Now, one of the ones downstream that your liver is going to use to try to metabolize androgens is going to be the cytochrome series of cytochrome P450 series of enzymes, class of enzymes. Now, in oddly shaped, like these foreign compounds, like your body doesn't should have never seen a 17 methylated C17 methylated androgen before, but it has these class of enzymes that can kind of deal with it. But the shape, since it's not perfect,
Mhm.
it will cause sort of what sort of these incomplete redox reactions, right? And this is going to cause the generation of free
Phil, I got
radicals.
to ask you, what's the main functional difference between the HSD enzymes and the cytochrome P450 enzymes?
So the 17 beta HSD uses NAD plus as electron acceptors, and it oxidizes the OH group like we went over. The downstream cytochrome enzymes are using oxygen as the final electron acceptor, and it transfers electrons from the substrate to NADP to the to oxygen. And since oxygen here is the final electron acceptor, if we have some weird shaped substrate where the enzyme can't completely fit around it, it may not transfer all the electrons that it needs to because the fit isn't like perfect, because it's so oddly shaped. So this means that there's going to be potentially incomplete transfer of electrons at the end to oxygen, which would, of course, be generating reactive oxygen species like superoxide.
So both of these are contributing to the androgen-mediated effects of increasing oxidative stress in the liver. It's just slightly different pathways. And to your point there, the 17-beta HSD, the main function is to ultimately make it into a keto steroid, right? Which I believe is more polar, and that's exactly what your kidneys need to excrete it out of the system. Is that correct?
Right. The ketone form of the androgen is going to be more polar, even though, so you have that OH group there, and some people might think that that's actually going to be more polar than a ketone, which is a double bond to oxygen. That might be something you want to put on the screen also. But because of, as we mentioned, the shape of of androgens of steroids,
Mhm.
the hydroxide group that's on that 17th carbon can actually do hydrogen bonding with nearby on the same molecule, on the same androgen, hydrogen bonding across the molecule, which stabilizes it and actually gives it a nonpolar characteristic to it, which is in the accumulation of androgen is what's going to cause the damage to the liver when the
Mhm. Yeah, big picture wise, it's the accumulation of androgen levels
right.
in the liver. The
and
more you
then
use, the worse it's going to be.
And then the polarity of the ketone, right? So you have a double bond to an oxygen. Oxygen has a high electronegativity. So it wants to accumulate electrons in a molecule, right? So all the electrons want to go towards this oxygen. So that's going to create a region of polarization of negative charge, which is going to make it water soluble and more readily able to be excreted by the body.
Yeah, yeah. So whatever the molecule is, when the body's trying to metabolize it, excrete out of the system, it needs to be water soluble so that it can go into the urine and get pissed out by the kidneys. But this also implies and is in line with practicality, which is that the more weird or different the molecule is, the antigen is from what your body already endogenously produces and knows how to metabolize, generally the trend here seems to be that it's worse for your health. It's more causing oxidative stress, even milligram for milligram. Just take a look at anadrol versus testosterone. I don't think there's any evidence that testosterone, even at very, very high doses, is liver toxic, but the evidence is actually there for things like anadrol, trenbolone, halotestin, and the other 17 alpha alkylated steroids.
Right. And I just want to reiterate these weird shapes are going to interact with the enzymes that are responsible for metabolizing them in a biological sense imperfectly,
Mhm.
which will downstream lead to the incomplete transfer of electrons and the
Uh-huh.
generation of reactive oxygen
The
species.
metabolism is less efficient, and because of that, the body has to try to metabolize it through a very inefficient means, which causes the generation of more reactive oxygen species. So, how does this play into your body's own endogenous antioxidant system with the electrons, the free radicals, and the NAD plus?
So the 17 beta HSD is going to we talked about it's going to oxidize that OH group on the 17th carbon, right? So that's going to remove a hydrogen and some associated electrons. Now the electrons need to go somewhere, and NAD plus is going to be the electron acceptor. Now, of course, this isn't the same NAD plus, or this is the same NAD plus, but its role here
Mhm.
is not in energy extraction necessarily. It's in detoxification and oxidation because it's such a good electron acceptor, if that's what you're
Okay.
trying to get.
So that would actually cause NAD plus to be turned into NADH. Is that correct?
Right. In the context of these 17 alpha methylated androgens, if this enzyme is not doing its normal metabolic process as it would with bioidentical testosterone, there you would have a hypothetical accumulation of NAD plus there.
Okay. Because I was actually looking into the research on this just yesterday, and it looks like the NAD plus to NADH ratio is a marker of oxidative stress. But the weird thing is, if that ratio is very high, that could be a very good thing. But if that ratio is also high, it could also signify that your mitochondria and a lot of oxidative stress, like negative things, inflammation, is also happening. In this case, of course, it's the latter. It's the body stressed out
Right.
and it's depleting the NAD plus stores, which might imply that supplementing or perhaps experimenting with compounds that boost NAD plus specifically, maybe NADA plus itself, would perhaps attenuate this liver toxicity, maybe more so directly than other liver protective effects here?
This is tough because, as we mentioned in the other podcast, NAD plus is a cofactor and it's ubiquitous in metabolic processes. It's everywhere, right? So it's sort of like, and this is my opinion, this is my interpretation of what we're looking at here, is that it would be analogous. If you wanted to supplement with NAD plus, in this case, it'd be like if you had a paper cut and you took a huge Band-Aid, closed your eyes, and tried to put it on like another percent of paper cut. You try to put it on there. You might get it because the Band-Aid is so large, but since your eyes are closed, you might miss it. Right. So you're kind of using NAD plus potentially as a blanket, which in other metabolic processes, if you're NAD plus deficient, for sure, 100%. But whether or not in this case, this is what's required, seems like, in my opinion, I could be totally wrong. There would be other ancillaries you could take to potentially try to use to mitigate oxidative
Protect your
stress
liver.
here.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
is it at least correct to say that if you use a heavy dose of 17 alpha alkylated oral steroids, then you're definitely going to cause some level of depletion to the liver's stores of NAD plus?
I don't want to say anything either way. It seems like it would.
In
Potentially,
theory.
but you're getting that buildup. You're getting
Mhm.
that buildup, right? Because it's the NAD plus is not able to be reduced to the NADH form due to the fact that it can't uh, biologically, in a correct biological way, interact with the 17 beta HSD and the 17 alpha methyl androgen. So you would get that buildup of NAD plus,
Mhm.
essentially. And then what happens to the NAD plus after that is going to be up to the biological environment.
Okay, and that buildup isn't the good kind of healthy buildup. It's
Right.
the other
But
direction.
then again, though, like you said, it's just a marker. So the marker itself doesn't necessitate cellular damage, of course.
Yeah, yeah, it's just a reflection of something that's going on.
That's going on. Yeah.
Speaking of buildup, another problem that oral steroids often causes is indigestion and GERD-like symptoms. A lot of this has to do with how it's affecting the gallbladder and bile. Kind of curious, what's the implication here with androgens and why do they cause the buildup of bile?
Right. So as we mentioned earlier, the that OH group on the androgen, it wants to be oxidized, or your body wants to oxidize it. And now if we're looking at the 17 alpha alkylated or 17 alpha methylated steroids, this methyl group not only acts as a physical perturbance to the enzyme substrate complex in 17 beta HSD, but also sort of acts as a pool of electrons. And the CH3 has all the electrons around carbon, it has electrons in the bonds with hydrogen. It can sort of donate these electrons to the middle of the structure and cause this sort of electronic dispersion across the molecule, which actually decreases its polarity. Now, when we're talking about a less polar molecule, we're talking about a hydrophobic, a lipophilic molecule. And if your body can't oxidize that OH group, making it more polar, it's even more nonpolar. So we have these two things going on. The fact that it's not able to lose that hydrogen, it's going to stay the OH. You have a buildup of the 17 beta OH androgen, and then you have this methyl group attached to it, which further decreases the polarity. The less polar molecule is more easily able to essentially stab itself into the phospholipid bilayer membrane of liver cells, and this can modulate these transporters that are associated with regulating electrolyte concentrations in bile. And then this causes bile buildup in the liver cell.
Just to reiterate from our last podcast discussion, when you're saying polarity, non-polarity, polar molecules have a very asymmetrical distribution of electronegativity, and that has to do with that noble gas configuration. I believe fluorine is the most
Most
the
electronegative.
highest one because it's so close to having that 8 valence electron state. It really, really, really wants to take an electron. Was that correct?
Right.
Okay, perfect. So if it's nonpolar, and you're saying that what the body wants to do in this case is create a already rather nonpolar compound. Steroids are pretty nonpolar, and wants to
Mhm.
make it even more nonpolar, and that means that the electronegativity distribution becomes more symmetrical. But the problem therein lies our cells, including our liver cells, have that phospholipid bilayer, which means nonpolar in the middle, right? And then polar heads on the outside. Generally speaking, in biochemistry, nonpolar molecules can go through that phospholipid bilayer with much more ease than polar molecules. And what this kind of reminds me of is when someone injects anadrol versus orally takes anadrol, even if they take the same milligram amount, there seems to be a difference in effects, not just how drastic the anabolic androgenic signaling is, but one theory is that one of the metabolites, one of the million metabolites of anadrol taken orally, when it undergoes this multiple hepatic metabolism, that's what's actually causing a lot of the effects, both the good and the bad in that sense. And that seems to perhaps be in line with this, that it's not that when you take these oral steroids, it just gets excreted out. Some of the metabolism from the liver, as you're describing here, actually allows that molecule that's generated from that metabolism to become even more active because it's now easily becoming more nonpolar and more easily going through phospholipid membranes. In theory, would that be the same conclusion that you're coming to here, Phil?
I would say so, yes. And the general, like you said, androgens, steroids in general are already nonpolar. The buildup of them in the cells is not good, particularly for that reason. And we're talking about bile also.
Hmm.
So bile is a detergent. It's amphipathic, if you know. It's
That
like the
means
phospholipid,
it's both,
right?
right?
Just like the phospholipid bilayer. It
Hmm.
has a polar part and a nonpolar part. So when you get the buildup of bile that's caused by this extremely nonpolar androgen buildup in the cell, it acts as a detergent, it's amphipathic, and it starts to dissolve the bile. But yeah, going back though to what you said, I'm definitely not familiar with. I've never heard of anyone injecting anadrol before, but I would assume that all the hepatic byproducts, the metabolic byproducts, would have varying polarities and
Yeah.
then also then varying interactions with the phospholipid bilayer and transporter enzymes
Mhm.
responsible for transfer where the bile goes.
Yeah, and again, we can't like prove this because there's not that much studies on this, but it does kind of follow that general pattern of the more harsh an androgen is, but more specifically, the more non-polar and ungiving a androgen is and stable, so resistant to metabolism. Take
Mhm.
a look at trenbolone. It's the one injectable that's known to cause liver stress, even though you're not orally ingesting it. It's so stable, it's not even C17 alkylated, but it's also extremely non-polar. Have you taken a look at the
Production of
structure of
trenbolone.
trenbolone?
No, the only thing really that comes to mind right now is that it is a poor substrate for aromatase, isn't it?
Trenbolone does not aromatize at all.
Right, right. Okay.
I think in order for something to be aromatized, it needs to be like a delta 4
We
configuration.
mentioned that earlier that a lot of the modifications done in those earlier carbons are going to be for to modify whether or not the androgen is a good substrate for aromatase.
Yeah, in which case trenbolone is not, and
It's
neither
not,
is
right?
it for 5-alpha reductase. So it's a very
So it
stable.
stays as trenbolone as much as relatively as much as possible.
Yeah, and
For the
even though it's
body.
not undergoing hepatic first pass, well, it's going through hepatic pass eventually as it circulates around the body and hits your liver again and again. But going back to the big picture here about oral steroids and just steroids in general that seem to cause more oxidative stress, what's the problem with oxidative stress? Like, why is that? What's like the whole issue with reactive oxygen species, free radicals?
Right. So if we're talking about reactive oxygen species, like we mentioned earlier, electronegativity wise, fluorine has the highest electronegativity, right? So it wants to take electrons. Oxygen is the second highest electronegativity. That's why in most redox reactions, they're referred to one component is being oxidized, which means its electrons are being taken, and the other one is being reduced, which means it's being given electrons. Now, oxygen happens to be biologically probably the most prevalent oxidizing agent because of its electronegativity. It tends to be the one that takes electrons in most metabolic processes. Most, of course, notably cellular respiration, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. Reactive oxygen species in general cannot be called biologically bad because they also serve as signaling molecules. Now, what will make reactive oxygen species bad tends to be the presence of a free radical, like you mentioned. And
What is a radical and what makes it free?
right, it's a super simple definition that if anyone's taken organic chemistry, they should be quite familiar with. All a free radical is an electron that's unpaired. Now, this comes into energy stabilization. So if you have oxygen O alone has 6 electrons. It wants 2 more to have a noble gas configuration.
Of
So it
eight.
kind of wants that extra one.
Hmm.
If it has one extra one, it wants to have another paired with it, which is a low energy state. Any electron that's unpaired is a higher energy state. And in the body, this means that a free radical is going to want to steal an electron from anything to pair its electron, whether that be DNA or protein in disease cases. It
So a
wants
free
elect-
radical has very, very high electronegativity.
You could think of it that way. Now, usually electronegativities aren't get like you don't call something like a free radical electronegativity. You refer to an element or an atom uh, in its natural state. But yeah, it would have a high electron affinity. Would be that ter the term.
Okay, so because of that, it's like this distraction of all your normal cells in the presence of a free radical. That free radical is like, I'm going to take an electron from somebody. Who is it going to be? I don't care if it's DNA or
Exactly.
protein, I'm taking that shit.
Exactly. And this sort of indiscriminate nature of free radicals and the rate at which they act is why they're so metabolically, cellularly dangerous.
Uh-huh.
Even though
Now,
reactive oxygen species in general aren't necessarily dangerous, a lot of times they're beneficial as signaling molecules. So I'll make sure that's clear.
yeah, I mean, physiologically, free radicals that is produced by resistant exercise is important for the mTOR cascade of protein synthesis signaling. Now, when you take a electron because a free radical has ripped it from a DNA, and proteins, I mean, that would ultimately, in excess, start to change the primary, secondary, tertiary folding of those proteins and cause DNA breaks and like literally break it from the inside out. Is that the idea here?
Yeah, exactly. And again, this is a term from organic chemistry that I'll reference. They're in the process of what happens in reactions involving free radicals. There's 3 steps. Initiation, so the initial generation of the free radical. Now, in diseases, this is why people say stay away from like UV light, right? Limit your exposure to UV light because UV light is high energy, so it can actually go hit a molecule and bounce one of its electrons out. And that would, for example, be an initiation. Or in the case of what we're talking about, if you have a poor fit substrate enzyme, it might not transfer all the electrons. It only transfers one electron, generating a free radical. And there's propagation, which is what you were basically referencing there. It's like, all right, now we have generated this free radical. It wants to start stealing electrons, and it can cause this cascade,
Hmm.
this like chain reaction effect where electrons just keep getting stolen from
Hmm.
other nearby
Phil,
molecules.
can you just reiterate one more time? I understand that reactive oxygen species can generate free radicals. Like that's the idea here, right? Same thing with reactive nitrogen species. Why is it that oxygen can generate a free radical? Like, is it pulling that electron from somewhere?
I mentioned it in the first part of this segment, right? Is that the electronegativity of oxygen is the big deal. So it has one electron, and oxygen has an electronegativity, a high electronegativity. So it already wants more electrons. That paired with the fact that since it has one unpaired, a paired state is very low energy compared to one just hanging out.
And
If
the
that makes
body wants low energy states that are stable and not high energy states that are
right,
unstable.
right,
So oxygen itself is not a free radical. The free radical
correct.
is the electron.
The in Lewis dot structures from high school chemistry, free radicals are denoted as just a one single dot
Mhm.
next to the atom.
The
And it
ox-
doesn't matter, it could have a charge, it could be
Mhm.
charged or uncharged. The charge doesn't matter as far as the term free radical is given. And now reactive oxygen species, some are free radicals, and those tend to be the more dangerous ones, kind of like we're saying, like basically that's what we're saying right now.
Mhm.
But reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species in general don't have to be free radicals. It's a subset of those ROS and RNS.
Okay. Real quick, I know you gotta get going here, Phil, so I just want to ask this. In normal physiology, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. That's happening in the mitochondria with aerobic respiration, and it goes through the carrier molecules, the protein, generating that proton gradient that we talked about. And it's finally accepted by oxygen, right? And that's why we need the oxygen to make aerobic respiration. It's in the name, aerobic. In this process, in my understanding, even in normal processes, even like exercise, something that's good for you, free radicals are generated during exercise or normal aerobic respiration. Simply that whole part of oxygen being a part of the mitochondria's electron transport chain generates free radicals in
And
physiology.
it happens. It happens. Yeah.
Okay. The reason for that is the same thing with why you mentioned oxygen having a high electronegativity. It has one but it wants to get to that low energy, stable state. And that causes often, not always, the production of free radicals, which in excess can be damaging to our bodies, right?
As far as the damage is concerned of free radicals, it's more about the nature of the free radical itself. And I would say this is quite an important point to talk
Mhm.
about what causes cellular damage and why. Particularly if you are familiar, of course, with we mentioned it several times on this show, the hydroxide is OH, right? With a
Mhm.
minus normally. If you That minus means it has a negative charge. If you remove one electron from it, from
Mhm.
the oxygen in particular, it loses that negative charge, but is then a free radical. Now that's a small molecule and it's indiscriminate. That's one of the more quote
Yeah.
dangerous
Is
free
that,
radicals.
would that be donated, would that be denoted as dot OH?
Right, like we said earlier.
And
Yep.
that's hydroxyl, right? That's called hydroxyl.
Hydroxide.
I was just looking into that about Fenton chemistry and how vitamin C can be a
Yeah.
pro-oxidant in the presence of inflammation and excess iron.
Yeah.
Whole like Fe3. We'll cover that another day. I know we didn't necessarily prepare for that one, but basically, if our body has a very robust antioxidant system, that should, in theory, mechanistically, decrease the production of excessive, hard to predict free radicals. Yes.
Right. Hard to predict where they're going to steal electrons from. And now the term that's used to describe antioxidants often, of course, they've been popular in the news and in like social media recently, all these antioxidants is they're called free radical scavengers. Right. They'll if there's one nearby, they'll find it.
Uh-huh.
And I would this would might be an interesting note from a dietary nutrition standpoint. I'm sure you've heard of polyphenols and flavonoids and
Flavonoids,
anthocyanins.
anthocyanins.
Anthocyanins, right?
Mhm.
And those are associated with colorful fruits and vegetables, right?
Yes.
So it's interesting because they give the fruit that color because of how the light goes through these conjugated double bonds. I don't know if you've heard of this or not.
The one thing that I'm familiar with is that one of the reasons why those darker fruits and berries and vegetables make those antioxidants is to protect themselves from the UV
Right.
radiation.
They act as a buffer and they rotate or they bend the light in a very particular that gives them the color. But that aside, there's all these double bonds in the anthocyanins and the polyphenols uh, that it's an electron-rich environment. Now
Hmm.
we're talking about these free radicals that want to steal electrons. Well, if you have a high concentration of these polyphenols, et cetera, these antioxidants, it can
Uh-huh.
just take an electron. It can take an electron
Uh-huh.
from these conjugated pi bonds, and that this conjugated system that's in these antioxidants is long and it has so many electrons that it acts as its own buffer. So if a free radical were to steal an electron from these antioxidants, it doesn't tend to propagate this free radical chain reaction farther to more like DNA or protein.
Oh,
It
okay.
kind of
Because it has
acts
a
as a buffer
surplus. It has a surplus
of
of
electrons,
electrons that
these
it can
antioxidants.
donate to the free radicals to make them happy with the double,
With
stable
stealing
temperature.
the electrons. It acts as a source of electrons
Uh-huh.
for radicals. So that's where, in theory, all the antioxidant benefits of certain fruits and vegetables are
Uh-huh.
coming.
Real quick, NAD plus, is that an electron donor?
No, it's an acceptor. It would act as a temporarily or a transient intermediate for accepting electrons before those electrons can be given to some other higher stability molecule.
Yeah, yeah. So we want to, free radicals are fine in physiological quantities as long as we, take care of them before they start to do a whole bunch of damage to the cells.
Well, depends on the species, really, is because, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with nitric oxide for vasodilation.
Yes.
Nitric oxide is a free radical. It's an important signaling molecule. If you have low nitric oxide, you could have hypertension,
Hmm.
right? So it really depends on the species, and of course, quantity is important. If you have like a bunch of hydroxyl free radical, that's bad. But the hydroxyl in itself is damaging.
Okay. Yeah. Phil, this is absolutely fantastic. I think it was the most brain awakening type of podcast I've ever had. You're definitely someone who understands chemistry well and is able to teach it well. So do you offer some sort of service for students that need help with chemistry?
Yeah, I have a tutoring business for chemistry, Chem 1 and 2, calculus, and physics 1 and 2 for undergraduate students or high school students who are taking AP level
Okay.
courses.
And if they wanted to, see what you're about and give it a try, where should they go? How should they contact you?
So I have an Instagram page where I solve physics, calculus, chemistry, MCAT type questions. It's going to be prs.educ. and I have a website. It's going to be prs-educ.com. And yeah, people can DM me for a free consultation if they want to get A's, if they want to make their parents happy, if they want to get into med school.
All
Trying
the
to
Asians better listen up.
all well, the Asians should already be on the default mode of not needing a tutor. You know, but maybe the parents happy thing. But yeah, so yeah, it's gonna be prs-educ.com for the website, and then Instagram's prs.educ.